we're breaking down another mix bus today. If you're familiar with Kevin Davis, then you already know. But this guy has a really interesting style of mixing. He's worked with Outkast, Mariah Carey, Sam Smith. This particular mix that I was watching him break down was for Jennifer Hudson. Now, what he winds up doing on this particular track is really going for this old school retro vibe. Now, if you know anything about me, I really like that old school flavor. I have a soft spot for things that sound old school. Now, a lot of times, this is just a side note, if you want your stuff to sound old school, you have to use limitations like they used back in the day. I just love the way this track sounds that he did called Ain't No Way. And I want to talk about what he used on his mix bus. So let's move on. Let's break it down. Now, I don't have Slate plugins. I've got a couple, but I don't have all the whole bundle. The first thing Kevin Davis uses on his mix bus is the NTI EQ. Now, he uses that, I believe, in hardware form, okay? But if you're not familiar with the NTI, the guy Cliff Mag, who invented the NTI, invented the Mag EQ4. So you don't have to stress and go out and buy a piece of hardware for thousands and thousands. Just use the Mag 4 EQ. You're doing all right. This is what he did after NTI, was he created the Mag 4. So it's like the updated version of it. Does it sound exactly the same? No, but it gives you pretty much what it did as far as controls go and everything else. So I believe that the NTI is a 3-band. This is a 4-band. So you get a little more juice for the squeeze, in terms of different parameters you can adjust because you got that extra band. But the Mag 4 is a phenomenal EQ. And if you haven't tried it on your mix bus, you should. So Mag 4 EQ is his first thing. Then he's got the Slate digital tape machines. So the Slate digital tape machine, the virtual tape machine, is this thing. Now, I don't own this thing, okay? But I own tons of tape machines. So if you don't own this, don't sweat it. But if you do, then you're probably aware of how cool this is, because this does some cool stuff that a lot of other tape machines do differently. That's the thing with tape I find so interesting, like the tape plugins specifically. No two of them sound the same, and you get a lot more than you bargain for just by putting it on and turning anything. They all sound different. Kramer tape sounds different than the ATR, sounds different than the Studer, sounds different than the Oxide tape. The Abbey Road version, like they all sound different. So when we go through this thing, just realize he's got a tape plugin first. Now, in my opinion, the thing that I can get kind of close to the Slate virtual tape machine is this thing, this 3348, which I really like. And maybe it's just because it's one of my newer plugins that I've bought that I have a tendency to use it a lot on the mix bus especially. But this is that it's kind of like a digital tape machine, and an analog one combined. It's the way it sounds to me. I know it's basically based on the digital tape machine, right? But there's just like a digitally controlled tape machine has a totally different flavor than the analog only tape machines. And for some reason, to me, this one gets closest to what the Slate one does, in my opinion. But if you could have other ones, if you don't have this, and I'm sure they'll work just as good. Even the Serban plugin one, by Make Believe, like that one could work in as a substitute for that also, potentially. So there's no magic to what's going on there, but he's really putting on a tape plugin, the Slate version for him. Then another choice I put up here, just so you could, if you had the Studer A800, because I talk about this one a lot and I love it, throw that there instead. There's no magic, but he's not stacking tape machines. He's got one, the Slate virtual tape machine, all right? So just pick one. For now, we'll just leave the 3348 on. Then after that, he's got that Revival plugin. Now, the Revival plugin is interesting, and like I said, I can't find it free. So if somebody knows what you got hoops to jump through to get that free or something, let me know, because I'm sure other people would want to know. But when you look it up, it says free, and then it ain't free. What free? Tell me about it. Anyway, so we're over here. We're trying to figure out another substitute for that Revival thing. And I came up with a couple options, because that Revival thing does a lot of stuff. It has a low end kind of tubey tape kind of thing, and like a brightness kind of shimmer thing on top. It looks like this. If you're not familiar with what it looks like, it just looks like this. It's got the shimmer, it's got the thickness, And he'll always run a trimmer kind of plug-in after it and before it, usually, to decide how much level he wants in and how much out. But basically, the shimmer and thickness thing, to me, what that screams is my favorite plugin. Now, if you've been watching over here, you may have decided this is a plugin you want too, but the reason it's so cool is because you can basically, it's a boost only plugin. So keeping in mind it's boost only, you can do so much with how you set cues, with whether or not you want warm, tube, tape, diode, digital, rectify. I mean, you got choices. So you could easily boost low end in any kind of way, from solid state to the clean setting to the tape to the tube to the diode, whatever, and then boost the top however you want also, and adjust the cue, and you got options. So to me, this is the most flexible plugin that does a similar thing to that other plugin, right? That Revival one. But if you don't have Spectre, another option, just to add a little low end, like kind of saturated sound, you could go with the Pultec EQP1A, and make sure you kind of move this to broad. I find on the MixBus, I'm hovering usually somewhere between 6 and 10, usually living it at 10 most of the time on the MixBus. Sometimes I'll back it down 7, 8-ish. But the point is, I'm not usually taking this in sharp territory here, because I want that cue as wide as possible. That's how I look at this. Now, like I said, you're boosting some lows, maybe 30, 60, 100, whatever, depending on the track. And you're boosting some highs. Maybe you're boosting 10K just to get some top-end shimmer, like that other one had a shimmer dial on it. So if you don't have that, maybe you have an API 550 A or B. Either one of those, any kind of emulation of an API kind of thing is going to give you some sort of extra warmth and bottom end that's not just turning a low band up on a Pro Q3. It's not going to be the same. It's going to sound a little different. So maybe a little of that in the lows and a little high-end boost, and you'll get something similar to this, kind of like a Revival thing, but then maybe follow it up with something else, like, I don't know, either an HG2 or like the Transformer plugin on, solid. If you have the Fusion Transformer plugin, you got this kind of shine thing to give you a bit of a Transformer top end kind of, I mean, there's no magic for how you're going to create exactly what he's doing with the Revival, but mess around with something along this line of maybe two plugins doing something similar. Like you'll add the EQP1A, and then you'll also add the Transformer thing, and maybe you'll get close. All right. After that, he uses something like, and if anybody has other ideas for what to substitute for the Revival, let me know. If you guys got something that's really close to it or similar, maybe I don't know about it, let me know. Also, after that, he's got an Air EQ, which is another Slate plugin. Now, the Air EQ looks like this. If you're familiar with the Air EQ, you basically have, it's just, I mean, there's nothing special, just an EQ. And he was doing hardly anything, very little, like almost to the point where it would be arguable whether it was doing a ton, whether a lot of people would even know that it was on or off. It was like quarters of a dB here and there was all he was doing. So no real huge magic. But what I want to say is I would substitute something like that. I love this EQ on the MixBus. Now, I didn't come up with it until I saw Chad Blake doing a similar thing. But what I found he was doing that I liked a lot was he was using it in, like, this is a multi-mono plugin. He's using this in multi-mono. The other version looks way more knobbage than this. So this plugin he was using in mono on his MixBus, multi-mono, and I found that really cool and interesting and just sort of really straightforward. I love the way this plugin works, especially when you're trying to get older school vibe kind of stuff going on. Just, you could boost low end, like, or blunt. So basically they're describing what the cue looks like. It's a blunt cue, a blunted object, as opposed to medium blunt. Now see how it's getting a little more pokey, starting to poke out a bit. See? So you see the difference? Blunt, medium sharp, the cue gets sharper. So I just love how this EQ works, and that works on all three bands. You got a 3-band thing, so you're not forced to sit here and mess around thinking little tiny stuff. I mean, it's not exactly a surgical EQ, but I just love this EQ. So if you're going to put an EQ on your MixBus to mess around with stuff, I like that one a lot, and that's the Abbey Road, what is it, the 53? It's the passive, like, R53, I think. That's what I'm remembering. What is that? Yeah, R55.6. What is it? What does that say? RS56. That's what it is. Very cool stuff. After that, so he's got his Air EQ there. So just to recap, he's got NTI as his first one, but Mag EQ is a good substitute. He's got Slate Virtual Tape Machine as a second one. 3348 tape's a good substitute, or the Studer, or some other combination, of other tape machines, whatever you have. And then after that, he's got the Revival plugin, which for us, Spectre is probably the best option, in my opinion. If not, EQP1A or an API 550 combined with, 550A, for example, combined with something like a transformer plugin or some kind of saturation plugin like HG2 or something like that. Then you got your EQ, which he's using the Airband. Then after that, he's got a variable mu. Now, we talked about Ben Babty and also, I believe, Tom Elmhurst both use this thing on mid-side, but not over here. Kevin Davis is using it in the stereo mode. And just sort of the theme here, and the theme you'll notice with a lot of these guys, like little bits. Plugins like this, when the needle's just barely moving, it's doing a lot. So you don't have to make it crushing, especially on the mix bus. Just a little tiny bit of movement. It could be good enough. All right, so a relatively, if you notice the recovery, it's not all the way to fast. He had it set over here. But again, don't focus so much on the settings. But at the same time, you need a starting point. He had the recovery almost all the way fast, one click back. And he had his attack almost all the way slow, little bit up from that. Okay, so just get what's going on. The rest, he wasn't using any of the high-pass filter sidechain stuff. It was just set to flat. So and he was on compress, because he wasn't doing a mid-side thing, so it's more typical to use it on compress, I find, when people do that. Now, after that, Pro L2. The Pro L2 is his version of just kind of want to see what happens during mastering, but he will often take this off when he does send to mastering. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is he wasn't like boosting the gain like crazy or anything, so he was coming in where he was doing about 3 to 4 dB of gain reduction, sometimes a little less than the 3 dB, but somewhere around there, and he was just comfortable with that. Now, what he mentioned is he's really just listening, and he also had true peak limiting all over the place. Now, some people are a fan of true peak, and some people don't like the way it sounds. It's just important to note, who has these things on. But again, this is one of those throwaway plugins where he'll take it off when he's sending it to mastering. So it's a great limiter. But if you're doing the work yourself, just keep in mind that, for him, he's just using it as his final, so nothing clips, so he can listen through it. That's really all he was doing. And as far as gain reduction goes, like the thing he was saying is sometimes, like while he's mixing, if he hears something crazy, he's got to constantly adjust his gain structure to get it to sound the way he wants. And a big tell for that is if this is crushing way too hard, but on a hip hop track or something like that, it will be crushing harder than on something that has a lot more life and air and breath. And that's not always every hip hop track, but it's just a general kind of, we're being general here. If it's a dance track or hip hop track or something, you may get severely more gain reduction on the limiter than something that has a lot of life and a very retro old school vibe and flavor. So that's where he was at. I actually don't know exactly what settings he had going on for any of this part of the limiter. But like I said, I didn't get the impression that this mattered to him at all, other than just something to keep the red lights off, and it eventually goes. Like, it's not something that sticks on the mix. Although, in my opinion, every limiter has a flavor. So especially people today who don't send your stuff to mastering, experiment with different limiters. They all sound completely different. Like, there's a huge difference between using the FabFilter Pro L2, which has a sound and has many different ways you can set it, or using the Waves L2, or using, the Oxford limiter that I use a lot, or using Limitless. There's different, I don't know if there's a plugin that has as much of a difference in sound as limiting plugins do, honestly. That's one of the things that has such a big sonic signature when you throw it on, because they work slightly differently to achieve the same thing. The T-Rax Uh, the brick wall limiter is an interesting one too. I mean, there's so many good ones out there that all have a slightly different vibe. And just consider, if your mix isn't working, maybe you should try a different limiter. It doesn't always hurt. Experiment with things like that. All right. Now, anybody have any questions, comments, answers? Throw it in the comments. I really appreciate it. Hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. More of these to come, and tons of other stuff too. Evan Jaffe, Custom Cut Studios. You guys got this. Take it easy.